Okay, hello Cloud Gurus and welcome to this lecture. In this lecture we're going to talk about CloudFront signed URLs and cookies, and then we're also going to look at S3 signed URLs. And essentially what is going to happen is when you go into the exam, you're going to be given a bunch of different scenario questions, and you need to decide whether or not you're using a CloudFront signed URL or cookie, or if you're just using an S3 signed URL. So before we explore what the difference is between the two, let's just review what we've learnt about CloudFront. So CloudFront is Amazon's CDN or content distribution network. It's a way of caching your large files at locations that's close to your end users. So an edge location is simply the location where the content is going to be cached. And this could be, this is different to an AWS region or availability zone. We have a lot more edge locations than we do regions or availability zones. The distribution is simply the name that's given to the CDN, and this consists of a collection of edge locations. And a distribution will be connecting up to an origin, and this is the origin of all the files that the CDN is going to distribute. And this can either be an S3 bucket, or it could be an EC2 instance, or it could be an elastic load balancer with a whole bunch of EC2 instances behind it, or it can even be Route 53. And then we have two different types of distributions. We've got our web distributions, which is typically used for websites. And then we've got our RTMP distributions, which is used for media streaming. So the first thing is we need to look at what if you've got a site where you want to restrict content access. So where people who are viewing video files, for example, need to pay to view it. And that's exactly what we do at A Cloud Guru. So we use CloudFront, and we want our members who pay our monthly or annual fees to be able to access the entire platform. So we need to be able to restrict our content access. So how do we do this? Well, we use signed URLs or cookies. But where would you use a URL versus a cookie? So we use CloudFront signed URLs where you've got an individual file. So say you want somebody to be able to access one individual file. So one file equals one URL. If, however, you want that individual to be able to access multiple files, like for example, if you log into A Cloud Guru, you want to be able to view all the different lectures that we have, then you essentially, instead of giving them a URL, instead you would give them a cookie, and you'd do a signed cookie, and then they can go ahead and access multiple files. So if you do get a scenario-based question and it's talking about premium content, and they need to go in and view a whole bunch of different video files, for example, then you will be using a cookie. If it's just one file, then you can use a signed URL. So when we create a signed URL or a signed cookie, we attach a policy, and the policy can include things like the URL expiration, so how long it's valid for, IP address ranges, so if you know your end customer's IP address ranges, you can put that in there as well as trusted signers, so you can say which AWS accounts can create signed URLs. You can put that in a policy as well. So in terms of how signed URLs work, well, here we have our CloudFront distribution with our edge locations. That's connecting into our backend to our origin, which is in this case an S3 bucket, or it could be an EC2 instance or an elastic load balancer, etc. And it's using OAI to do that authentication. So users will not be able to access by default the S3 bucket or the EC2 instance directly. It's using Origin Access Identity, OAI. So your users will only be able to access CloudFront, which then uses OAI to access the origin. So we've got our client here. They then could log into our application. So they enter in their username and password. So we have our authentication and authorization. So the application looks at their username and password, says, yep, you can log in. And then it uses the SDK to generate a signed URL. So it's using CloudFront SDK to generate a signed URL or a signed cookie, and it's returning that back to the client. The client can then use CloudFront to access the files in S3 or EC2 or Elastic Load Balancer, etc. So CloudFront signed URLs, you can have different origins, so it doesn't have to be EC2, it can be S3, it could be Elastic Load Balancers, etc. When you generate that key pair, it's account-wide and it's managed by the root user. So when you're generating that signed URL, it appears as a key pair and that is managed by the root user. You can utilize all the caching features of CloudFront, and you can also filter by date, by path, by IP address, by expiration, etc. So that's a CloudFront signed URL. An S3 signed URL is slightly different. This is where you're not using CloudFront, where people have direct access to S3. And it basically, when you create this, it issues a request as the IAM user who creates the pre-signed URL. So you have all the same permissions as the IAM user who has created that signed URL. And S3 signed URLs have a limited lifetime. So when you go into the exam, if they're talking about a CloudFront signed URL versus an S3 signed URL, or just think about whether or not your users can actually access S3. If they're using OAI through CloudFront, then they can't. So you'd be using a CloudFront signed URL. But if they can access the S3 bucket directly and it's just an individual object, then you probably want an S3 signed URL. So going into the exam, just remember to use signed URLs and cookies when you want to secure content so that only the people that you authorize are able to access it. Remember that a signed URL is for individual files and one file equals one URL. A signed cookie is for access to multiple files. So one cookie allows you to access multiple files, and that's what we use at A Cloud Guru. And then remember that if your origin is EC2, then you want to use CloudFront. If your origin is going to be S3 and you've only got a single file in there, then you want to use a S3 signed URL instead of a CloudFront signed URL. So that is it for this lecture, everyone. If you've got any questions, please let me know. If not, feel free to move on to the next lecture. Thank you.